and so, and that's in some ways what I do. So there are, I think, some innovative or some might say controversial interpretations, but I'll leave that up to you to talk about. Okay, here we go. In Judaism, God is the ultimate role model. You shall be holy, says the priestly code, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. If the followers of the Lord are to be a kingdom of priests and a holy people, quote unquote, that walk in his ways, then to adhere to the divine word involves imitatio Dei, the imitation of the deity. When the Hebrew Bible depicts God as creator of the universe, we learn that creative activity is sanctified. From the description of God resting on the seventh day, worshippers derive that they too are to rest. God adheres to a moral code, so Abraham adopts this code. God redeems the oppressed in Egypt, from which Israel is to understand and never to oppress the powerless. Just as God is merciful and gracious, says the Midrash, so too you need to be merciful and gracious. It is instructive, therefore, that the rabbis envisioned God in their own image, as a Talmid Chacham, both a student and a teacher of Torah. In the words of Shimon Ravidovich, one of the founders of American Jewish thought, God in the Midrash, this is a quote, God in Midrashic Judaism is the eternal student. He learns with Israel, learns always and everywhere. He learns with the sages in the academies of Palestine and Babylonia. He learns with the learners of Yavna, Sepphoris, Surah, and Pompadita. The creator of the world studies halakha, studies Jewish law. As the judge of the world, God also teaches. Ravidovich continues, when the sages in Israel cannot agree on the settling of a controversy or halachic problem, they call for divine decision, for divine intervention. Rav, the Amora of the 2nd century, went even so far as to describe exactly the daily agenda of God Almighty. The first 3 hours, God learns Torah. The second 3 hours, he judges the world. The third 3 hours, he feeds the world. Study and teaching in this tradition are holy acts, and the teacher of divine wisdom is a revered personality. The rabbinic teacher represents God both symbolically by imitating divine behavior and pedagogically by leading students to understand and embrace divine teachings. This is why the rabbis taught that if you must choose between saving your teacher or your parent, save your teacher first, for your parent, quote, brings you into this world, but your teacher introduces you into the world to come. It should come as no surprise then that the rabbis referred to the traditions they received from God at Sinai as Torah, which literally means instruction or teaching. In revealing Torah to the Israelites in the desert, God also disclosed a pedagogic aspect of the divine personality. Since God is our ultimate teacher, to study Torah is to worship God, and to worship the divine is to engage in a certain respect in the study of Torah. There's a halachic distinction here. There's a distinction in Jewish law about whether when one worships, one actually is engaged in the study of Torah, but it's a fine distinction. But the worship service is grounded on the study of Torah. Nowhere are educational images of God more pronounced, therefore, than in Jewish liturgy. At the heart of the rabbinic worship service is the recitation of a citation from Deuteronomy, the famous passage, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Take to heart these words which I charge you this day. Teach them diligently. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home, when you're on your way, when you lie down, and when you get up, and so on. A famous passage, I'm sure familiar to you all. This passage encapsulates an educational orientation. Faith in God is to be taught by means of recitation of sacred texts at home and away from home, and by means of actions, binding holy words on our hands, doors, and gates. What is the origin of this pedagogy? It is the very method that God used to instruct the Israelites. To adhere to the words of the Shema is not only to follow God's teaching, but also to imitate God as teacher. Thus, the Deuteronomist introduces this passage with the words, in quote, this is the instruction, the teaching, the laws and the norms that the Lord your God has commanded me to impart, that is, to teach to you this day. To drive this divine pedagogy home, the biblical text continues after its rending of the Shema with a response to a query. When in times to come your son shall ask you, what mean these exhortations, laws, and norms which the Lord our God has enjoined upon you? You shall say to your son, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord commanded us to observe all of these laws with reverence. It will be therefore to our merit before the Lord our God to observe faithfully this whole instruction as he commanded us. Our observance of divine instruction is predicated upon God's deeds, the redemption from Egypt, and divine words, the revelation at Sinai. Just as God taught us to observe the Torah with actions and with verbal explanations, so we are to teach our children and students God's message by example and through study. Two aspects of this instructional method are worthy of note. The section is called Dialog and Inquiry. The first is dialogical. The father's actions and explanations respond to the son's question. We see this question and answer format in Exodus as well. Quote, and when your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, because he passed over the households of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but saved our houses. Similarly, in relation to the eating of matzah, the unleavened bread, the text states, and you shall explain to your children on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I went free from Egypt. And finally, in connection with the redemption of the firstborn males, the Bible relates, and when in time to come your sons ask you, saying, what does this mean? You shall say to him, it was with a mighty hand the Lord brought us forth from Egypt, the house of bondage. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord slew every firstborn in the land of Egypt, and the firstborn man and beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord every male issue of womb, but redeem every firstborn among my sons. The rabbis were so enamored with this dialogical pedagogy, they constructed the typology of both questions and those who would ask them in the well-known Midrash of the four sons, Midrash Habanim, it's called in Hebrew. That this Midrash, famous Midrash, appears among many other places in the Passover Haggadah. The Torah has four children in mind, one intelligent, a second wicked, a third simple, and a fourth, a child who does not know how to ask. I'm not going to read the Midrash because I want to run through, but it's a well-known Midrash that basically lays out four different kinds of questions. It's a topic at the Passover Seder in every Jewish household that celebrates that Seder. That's a central focus of the way in which the Seder is constructed. But I want to focus here on the pedagogical point, not on the theological point. The asking of questions becomes so essential to this pedagogy that the liturgy for Passover Eve was built around four questions that are mandatory, even if it might be supposed that all present know the answers. The Mishnah in Masechet Pesachim prescribes that the son asks his father just as depicted in the Bible. Current practice is that the youngest child asks. However, if only a husband and wife are present, the wife asks the question. And if one is alone, he or she must read the question. Even two scholars reads the passage from the Talmud Bavli. Even two scholars who know the laws of Passover ask one another the questions. The asking of questions is central to this pedagogy. The dialogue of the Passover Seder is illustrative of the entire rabbinic pedagogical tradition. The whole of the Talmud is built around the shakla v'tarya, the give and take of asking questions and posing questions among students and teachers. Indeed, the idea that Torah study should be rooted in the dialogue of questions and responses becomes so rooted in the rabbinic tradition that when the 11th century scholar Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, wrote his classical biblical commentary, he assumed the questions were already understood. His job was to supply the answers. In addition, the Midrash and the Mishnah both demonstrate sensitivity to developmental and intellectual circumstances of those who ask. The simple question is taken no less seriously than the intelligent one. And even the so-called wicked, I would prefer rebellious child, is afforded a response. Indeed, the Mishnah teaches that if children do not know how to ask the Passover questions, their parents are to teach them, and the answer is to be given according to their abilities to understand. The point to be emphasized is that parents and teachers are not expected to invent this dialogical pedagogy out of whole cloth. Rather, when we take our children's and students' questions seriously, we are acting in the image of God. Dialogue is essential to the divine-human encounter. God models this dialogical pedagogy, for example, when calling to Adam in the Garden of Eden, Ayeka, where are you? And to Eve, what have you done? And after the murder of Abel, God also initiates a dialogue. Lord said to Cain, where is your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And then he said, what have you done? Hark, your brother's blood flies out to me from the ground, one of the most beautiful passages in the Bible. Nor is this dialogue one-sided. Humans can also initiate. When Abraham hears of plans to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of their sinfulness, he asks God, will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty? And here, what I consider to be perhaps the most beautiful passage of the Hebrew Bible, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, so the judge of all the earth not deal justly. Each time Abraham asks if the city can be saved for some number of innocents, 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10, God responds that he will not destroy the city for their sake. Moses also questions God, challenging the divine to live up to his own principles and promises. When God's anger ceased after the Israelites had betrayed him by worshiping the golden calf, God seeks to destroy the whole people as he has done to all of humankind in the generation of Noah, which we were just talking about. But Moses intervenes. Let not your anger, O God, blaze forth against your people, whom you delivered from the land of Egypt with great power and with mighty hand. Let not the Egyptians say it was with this evil intent that he delivered them, only to kill them off in the mountains and annihilate them from the face of the earth, and so on. God responds to Moses' entreaties as he did to Abraham, and the Lord renounced his punishment. He planned to bring the punishment that he planned to bring upon his people. The biblical God is also aware of the situated needs of those who receive revelation. I am the Lord, God said to Moses. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I do not make myself known to them as Yud He Vav He. To know someone's name in the Bible is to grasp his or her essential nature. For God to be revealed by one name to the patriarchs and by another to Moses and Aaron suggests that God discloses aspects of divinity according to the needs of the recipient or the requirements of the circumstance. The second point has to do with love, with caring and covenant. The second aspect of this pedagogy worth noting is that it is grounded in love. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. The form of this passage is perplexing. We are commanded to love God. But how can one love on command? Can love be rooted in coercive power and uncompromising obligation? And the answer to these queries lies in the fact that this command must be understood in the context of a covenantal relationship between God and the Israelites. The command to love God should be understood as responding to God's caring, which is offered first, like that of a parent to their children or a teacher to one student. The redemption and a relation were unsolicited acts of love that preceded the expectation of reciprocity. God's love is not calculated or utilitarian. It is unconditional and spontaneous. It is not because you are the most numerous of peoples that the Lord set his heart upon you and shows you, wrote the Deuteronomist. Indeed, you are the smallest of people, but it was because the Lord loved you. We are expected to love God much as a child loves her parents or student his teacher, because we have received unsolicited and unconditional love that confirms our very worth, even when we feel ourselves to be unworthy. The rabbinic morning literature captures the sentiment beautifully in its introduction to the Shema. With great love hast thou loved us, Lord our God. Great and abundant mercy hast hast bestowed upon us. And so too in the evening service. Thou hast loved the house of Israel, thy people, with everlasting love. Thou hast taught us Torah and precepts, laws, and judgments. So the second idea then is that this pedagogy is grounded in a relationship of caring or love between student and teacher. And now the distinction between obligation and authority. It is important to understand the nature of obligation implied in this relational context. God's authority is not coercive, as is sometimes supposed. Whether or not God could force the Israelites to observe the commandments, she chose not to do so. To enforce compliance would deny the very idea of Torah as both law and instruction. The very idea of a norm or teaching presupposes the free will of those who are called to observe it. Thus, the Deuteronomist wrote, "See, I have set before you this day life and good, death and evil, therefore choose life." Maimonides, in Hilchot Shuvah, the laws concerning repentance, explains why freedom is a prerequisite for any law or instruction. The human species has become unique. This is a quote from Maimonides, Hilchot Shuvah. The human species has become unique. There being no other species like it in the following respect, namely, that man of himself and by the exercise of his own reason knows what is good and what is evil, and there is none who can prevent him from doing that which is good or that which is evil. This doctrine is an important principle of Torah and the commandments, as it is said, "See, I set before you this day life and good, death and evil." If God had decreed that a person should be either righteous or wicked, or if there was some force inherent in his nature, which irresistibly drew him to a particular course, how could the Almighty have charged us through the prophets, do this and not that? Improve your ways. Do not follow your wicked impulses. When from the beginning of his existence, his destiny had already been decreed, or his innate constitution irresistibly drew him to that from which he could not set himself free. What room would there be for the whole of the Torah? End quote from Maimonides. God's authority is not coercive, but moral, born of an ongoing relationship with Israel. The well-known Christian pedagogue Parker Palmer points out that we often confuse coercive power with moral authority, but the two are not the same. Power works from the outside in, but authority works from the inside out. We are mistaken when we seek authority outside ourselves. This view of teaching turns the teacher into a cop on the corner, trying to keep things moving amicably by constant but always having recourse to the coercive power of the law. Authority is granted to people perceived as authoring their own words, their own actions, their own lives, rather than by playing a scripted role and great removed from their own hearts. When teachers depend on coercive power of law or technique, they have no authority at all. End quote from Parker Palmer. Exercising coercive power is a good way to lose authority. This is why parents or teachers who engage in power struggles with their children or students have already lost. When we resort to coercive power, we leave children with little choice but to rebel in order to exercise their own autonomy and forge their own identities. On the other hand, moral authority grows, in the words of the great Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, as power from within. Or to use the words of the philosopher of education, Thomas Green, education entails the formation of consciousness. Because it is cultivated from within, moral authority is fostered in the context of relationships in which feelings are shaped by the caring of one person for another. Martin Buber notes that relation calls for reciprocity. One should not try to delete the meaning of relation, he writes. Relation is reciprocity. This does not mean, however, that every participant in relation plays the same role. Clearly, God's position as teacher of Israel creates an asymmetrical relationship. As with any caretaker, God's caring for Israel does not call for an equivalent act of caring toward God by Israel in return. It calls for another kind of response that is appropriate to the one cared for. As the well-known feminist philosopher of education, Nell Noddings, points out, The responsive cared for in the fullness of a caring relationship feels the recognition of freedom and grows under its expansive support. The child generally cared for is free to respond as himself, to create, to follow his interests without necessary fear or anxiety. When the cared for gives to the relation either in direct response to the one caring, or in personal delight, or in happy growth before her eyes, this is genuine reciprocity. By teaching Torah, God sets us free to become who we might be, who we ought to be. Torah offers a framework, a vision of the good, if you like, within which it becomes possible to formulate ideals to live by. Mitzvot come to speak with Rosenzweig's inner power, or Green's voice of conscience, when Israel, as one cared for, reciprocates God's love with its own. By seeking, often struggling to discover and then to construct our best selves within the context of the ideals set forth in divine instruction, we acknowledge and confirm God's love. In response, she delights in our achievements, just as the student reaffirms the relation with the teacher when he learns what is being taught. Every commandment that we fulfill reaffirms the covenant God made with Israel at Sinai. And finally, the distinction between teaching and training. As we stream from the emphasis on dialogue and questioning, this by no means implies blind or unthinking acceptance of God's commandments. Indeed, it is hard to imagine how one could internalize any teaching mechanically without the investment of intelligent understanding. For a teaching to become mine, for me to own it, I must understand it and be able to adopt it, interpret it, apply it according to the circumstances of my life. This is the very essence of rabbinic hermeneutics. The idea that God intended for us to blindly follow Torah is antithetical to the very meaning of divine authority as conceived here. Hence, the classical doctrine, na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and then understand, is not, in my view, best understood as preferring mindless practice to religious understanding. Rather, it asserts the trusting relationship between God and her students calls ultimately for understanding based on learning rather than blind obedience. The word Shema in Hebrew actually means understand in the biblical and rabbinic sense, as opposed to other forms of hearing. Na'aseh v'nishma means by doing, I will come to understand. This is not to say, of course, that there is no role for rote learning in divine pedagogy. On the contrary, the Shema states clearly that its precepts are to be recited, even if they are not understood, night and day, at home and away. The role of such rote recitation is the connection. In this connection can be explained in light of distinction between unintelligent, intelligent behavior and belief, training and teaching, and mechanical and genuine learning. Unintelligent beliefs and behaviors are mechanical. To do or believe them, we need not form intentions, make decisions, attribute or interpret meaning, or draw conclusions. On the other hand, intelligent behaviors and beliefs require us to do one or more of these mental acts. Our hearts beat mechanically, but feelings of love or anguish require interpretation and understanding. Spelling is a routine process. Writing poetry requires intelligence. We train people to behave and believe mechanically, but we teach them to do so intelligently. We train students to count, but teach them to do algebra. We train them to recite the alphabet, but teach them to read. Teaching, in other words, always involves mental activity, forming intentions, making decisions, attributing or interpreting meanings, or drawing conclusions. It requires an attempt to communicate understanding to students. Teaching entails intelligence. Mechanical or rote learning is generally accomplished by means of training. Since training requires little understanding, no investment of will or mind is required on the part of the trainee to get the point. Training can fail, but the trainer always has the option of external control, reward, punishment, manipulation of the environment to produce the desired behavior. Genuine learning, on the other hand, requires the sort of understanding associated with teaching. For this reason, teaching and learning always involves the risk of failure. The student can miss the point. If she chooses not to learn or lacks sufficient preparation or capacity, she can get it wrong. Teaching and genuine learning entail the possibility of criticism. Sorry, there's a truck going by outside. Because it involves understanding, teaching is a moral activity, not in the sense that it entails particular ethical doctrine, but in the sense that it empowers students to make moral choices more intelligently on their own. Genuine learning is likewise a moral activity, involves acquiring the skills necessary for moral decision-making. In contrast, training is amoral, it is mechanical, and does not require the sort of understanding necessary for moral discourse. However, if training continues when teaching is in order, this is sometimes called indoctrination. For instead of empowering students with the capacity to act independently on the basis of their own understanding, we continue to require unintelligent mechanical responses. Under these conditions, the process of moral development is thwarted. Indoctrination is an amoral activity because it undermines the capacity to act as a responsible moral agent. The rote recitation called for in the Shema can be understood as a form of religious training that is an important step on the road to understanding divine teaching. It therefore enables us to receive and reciprocate God's love through the observance of mitzvot, God's commandments. The danger lies, however, in the possibility that the instructional process never moves beyond training to teaching. When this occurs, God's loving Torah is transformed into religious indoctrination. This is an anathema to God as a student and teacher of moral vision. For training without teaching, indoctrination undermines the very intelligence and free will upon which moral responsibility lies. And the final point, divine fallibility. We are accustomed to thinking of God in terms of absolutes, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, benevolent. Yet Yehuda Halevi refers to this, the great medieval Jewish philosopher, removes to this as the God of the philosophers. Halevi points out that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to which we should add also Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, is not an abstract concept, but a living being who strives to teach a moral path. The biblical and rabbinic deity is not a perfect, but a God who learns and teaches. She models indeed the very behaviors her Torah expresses in words. Since these are fundamentally moral activities, God as student and teacher is a moral agent. The moral agency requires fallibility. The fallibility inherent in moral agency follows from the requirement that free will follows from the requirement of free will. If I am to be held responsible for my actions, it must be supposed that I am the agent of those actions. It must be me who decided to enact them and who, in fact, caused them to happen. If the behaviors in question are the consequence of some other agent, say the gods, or my chemistry, or the forces of history, or society, or culture, the culture that I inherited in my family in which I was raised, then it is not I, but these other agents who are accountable for my behavior. If this were the case, as Maimonides points out, why bother with moral instruction altogether? Since it is not me who requires instruction, but the gods, or my chemistry, history, society, culture, or family. The very idea of Torah, the very idea of moral discourse is predicated on the fact that I, and not these other forces, am the agent of my actions. And so it is I who should be called to account when these actions have missed the mark. But if I was infallible, suppose it was part of my very nature, inherent in the logic, so to speak, of my essence, that I could make no moral error. In that case, it would not be me who was the agent of my action, but my very nature, or the logic of my essence. This is no different than supposing that the gods or chemistry or history, society or culture or family determine mine actions. In this case, it is the logic of my very nature that does the determining. And it is this logic or nature that needs to be addressed in order to affect change in my behavior. Moreover, if this were a necessary nature, as sometimes it would be argued about God, than that as Anselm argued, God than which a greater cannot be conceived. If this was a necessary thing, it could not be otherwise. Then change would be impossible. For me to be a moral agent, I must be capable of behaving badly and of changing my behavior. This is why I can benefit from instruction in goodness. If God, as student and teacher, is a moral agent, therefore, God too must be fallible. And the Hebrew Bible is full of examples of divine fallibility. This God admits mistakes, such as flooding the world. He argues with humans, such as Abraham. She changes course in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah. He gets frustrated and angry in the case of the golden calf and relates to people sometimes, as with Moses, even face to face. Why would a God who is all-knowing and all-powerful make a mistake or change course or argue or get angry? Why would such a God not create a world as perfect as he or she? Divine fallibility does not follow only from the logic of moral agency, however, but from other aspects of divine pedagogy as well. First, a learning God, as Rabidovich points out, indicates want, a need to fill a gap, a desire to improve one's mind, to widen one's understanding, to make up for deficiencies, to free oneself from ignorance. Rabidovich emphasizes the intellectual deficiencies implied by a learning God, but moral inadequacies are equally important. A learning God implies the desire to improve one's ways in addition to one's mind, to broaden one's capacity to care for others based on a wider and deeper understanding of to free oneself not only from ignorance, but also from wrongdoing. Moreover, if God were all-knowing, then it would be impossible for students to discover anything new. There would be no reason to challenge or question God as teacher, because it would be supposed that God had the truth in his pocket. There could be no genuine dialogue between teacher and student under these circumstances, and no real relationships. Questions could only be for the purpose of clarification, never discovery, and no form of reciprocity would be possible, since there is nothing God requires in return from the learning. So this leads me to a theology of teaching that I think grows from the Jewish tradition. Thomas Green, the well-known philosopher of education, argued that teaching is a norm rather than a rule governed by activity. Rules on this count are mechanical principles that dictate practice and limited flexibility. They require little understanding on the part of teachers, and when properly implemented, produce outcomes that can be explained by statistical generalizations upon which they are based. Norms, on the other hand, are intelligent guides to practice that are rooted in traditions of educational, moral, and religious thought, rather than experimental laws. Whereas rules provide explanations of student behavior caused by particular teaching techniques, norms provide reasons upon which teachers decide to pursue one course of action rather than another. Teaching, in this view, relies on traditions of pedagogy rather than on behavioral science. A theology in which the metaphor of God as teacher is taken seriously can be understood as the basis for significant tradition in which to ground the norms of teaching. God, in this theology, is the ultimate role model who enacts the deeds and words of her Torah. For pedagogy is not didactic, but dialogical, in which questions are encouraged, challenges embraced, and discovery is possible. Her relationship with her students is that of one caring, in which instruction is a vision of the good life lovingly offered. The appropriate response from the one cared for is to endeavor to discover one's best self, the person one was meant to be, within the communal and moral framework provided by God's Torah. Although this response relies on training and mechanical learning at the outset, it must strive to transform this training into understanding of God's teaching that can be owned by the students and internalized as a voice of conscience, speaking with the inner power of moral authority. The rewards of adopting this way of life are a natural consequence of the fulfillment we feel when we recognize that we are free to achieve our potential. The punishment of following other gods is a result of the frustration and rage we experience when our independence is thwarted and our potential denied. To transmit this message, God as teacher must be a good, not a perfect being, who is able to teach us by example how to learn from our mistakes, turn from our anger, and return to the right path. When we follow this model, we realize that each of us thinks when we follow this model, we realize that what each of us thinks and does matters desperately. The decisions we make, the values we embrace, determine the directions of our lives, not external forces outside of our control. If we make the wrong decisions, we can learn from our mistakes. We can change. We can redirect ourselves to a new and better course. We can take hold of our lives in this way because we experience the confirmation of God's caring. And when we do so, we demonstrate our own love of God by embracing her teaching and reconfirming our covenant with her. The rabbis called this process tshuva, or repentance. That we can learn from our mistakes and chart the course of our own lives is probably the most radical of all Jewish ideas. It is a precondition for any coherent account of teaching and learning and should stand at the heart of all educational theory.